Let's now turn our attention to nominal versus real rate of interest. So if you recall from our previous lecture, we discussed briefly the difference between real and nominal. Okay, so remember, the real rate of interest does not account for inflation. So what we're doing here is we're basically figuring out what the nominal rate of interest is. And in order to do that, we need to account for the real rate plus the interest rate plus the cross product of the interest rate and the real rate. So let's just take a quick example here. Let's assume that the real rate of interest is 6%, okay? Now, again, if we had a 6% return on $100, if we didn't consider inflation, we wouldn't truly get a 6% return. So we need to remember, what if inflation is, let's say, 2%? Well, that's going to help us determine our nominal rate of interest, okay? But we also have to recognize that there's inflation on the interest that's accumulated. So that's when we actually take 6% times, or the product of inflation, 2%. So now it's a little more specific. Typically what we'll say is that our nominal rate is about 8%, okay, right? So that's the 6 plus 2. But if we want to be really specific, we're going to add the additional 12%, or 0.12% in this case. So to be accurate, our nominal interest rate that accounts for that 2% inflation would be 8.2%. Now, if we consider inflation as a premium, we can look at it as an inflation premium. So, and this is all just basically, what's important to recognize is that each type of investment has different premiums associated with them. Now, all have inflation premiums associated, okay? But also, when we talk about default premiums, so remember, that's associated with risk, okay? So a higher default premium will give us the highest return on our rate, but there's more risk associated. And MP, that means a maturity premium, okay? So, for instance, if the longer that you invest, the longer it matures, there's definitely a premium with that. So in other words, the longer that you invest, the higher rate of return you'll receive, okay? So for instance, an example here, a 30-year corporate bond has a higher yield, okay? So you're going to get more return compared to a 30-year treasury bond, treasury bond yield, okay? Now the reason for that, now they both have a 30-year maturity premium, so the maturity premium is going to be the same, but the difference is the default premium is higher on a corporate bond because there's more risk associated with a corporate bond versus investing into a government yield, okay? So just remember that all investments have different rates of return based off of typically based off of risk premium and maturity premium. But we also have to include inflation as well, which is a constant. Finally, we're going to take a look at yield curves. Okay, so basically, the yield curve shows the relationship between interest rates and maturity. And ideally, typically, you should have an upward sloping yield curve, and that's a good sign. That shows good economic health. If you see a flat yield curve, that means that there's uncertainty. And if you see a downward sloping yield curve, that represents that there is a negative economy and things are not going well. For instance, sometimes we try to lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, and that's what's happening right now. So, in a nutshell, We discussed the difference between an annual percent rate, so APR, and an effective annual rate, ERA. We considered how the frequency of compounding has an amount of interest and total payments paid on consumer loans. We recognize the role of inflation premium, default risk premium, maturity risk premium, and the interest rates charged by lenders. Ultimately, it's essential to understand how interest rates work so we can understand more complex topics related to capital budgeting, capital structure, and cost of capital. Thanks for watching, and happy financing.